The morning had the sort of light that insists on being noticed, a slow, gold seepage over the spires that made every shadow appear reluctant to leave. I was later than intended, though that is not unusual, and my head carried the dull throb of last night's whiskey, not enough to impede thought, but sufficient to make movement feel heavier than it ought. The cloisters of St. Anselm's carried a faint chill, the stone still holding the memory of night. Somewhere beyond the quadrangle, a chapel bell began to toll, thin, almost apologetic. I followed it without any real intention, the sound threading itself through the vaulted passages like a lost thing seeking a listener. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Not the natural fade of distance, but the kind of cessation that suggests a hand had stilled it mid-swing. I stood a moment longer in the cloister, staring at nothing in particular, aware only of the absence it left behind. Beyond the gate, the college opened into a small, overgrown churchyard. A scatter of moss-covered stones leaned into the grass as if conspiring. On a bench by the south wall sat an elderly priest, head bowed, hands folded loosely in his lap. At first glance he might have been dozing in the late warmth or offering a private prayer to the silence. There was something too still about him, though, not the peaceful stillness of meditation, but the faintly troubling variety that makes you hesitate to speak. I passed without intrusion, though I glanced back once before turning the corner. His eyes remained closed, his profile framed by the stone arch and a curl of ivy that moved faintly in the wind. The bell did not resume. It was later, after a mediocre sandwich in the Randolph and a half-hearted attempt at a crossword I couldn't quite focus on, that the detail returned to me. His hands, unmoving on his lap, the right thumb resting over the left in a manner that seemed deliberate, like the first letter of a word I ought to have been able to complete. The Oxford Mail arrived the following morning. I rarely read the obituaries, except when the name is one I recognise. His was there, in the plainest of notices. Father Gabriel Lacey, aged 74, died suddenly after evensong in the vestry of St. Anselm's. The cause was given, as such causes so often are, with the tidy brevity of a post-mortem. Heart failure, apparently. Apparently. I found myself wondering who had written it. Such notices are not composed by strangers. Someone had decided the manner of his departure needed no embroidery, no allusion to the decades he must have served, no mention of family, of course. Perhaps there was none. That afternoon I walked again to the college, a route I have taken so many times I could pace it blindfolded. The bell was silent now, the air still carrying that faint autumnal perfume, wood smoke, damp leaves, and the thin metallic scent that comes before rain. In the churchyard the bench was empty, though I noticed the grass beneath it was flattened in an arc, as though by the habitual presence of one seated there for hours. I tried the chapel door. It yielded easily, and the interior was awash of shadows and dust motes. On the vestry table lay an open prayer book. The page had been marked not with a ribbon, but with a pressed sprig of rosemary, pale and brittle. I brushed a fingertip against it and felt it crumble. It was not deduction, not yet, just the faint stir of a question, no more substantial than the dust in the slanted light. Why had the bell stopped so suddenly? And why, when I saw him there, had I thought, absurdly, that he was waiting for something? I left without speaking to anyone. The porter at the gate gave me a small nod, the sort one offers to a familiar face whose business requires no inquiry. That evening, the crossword yielded its final clue. 6 letters for a word meaning remembrance, memory. I underlined it twice, though I could not have told you why. Lewis has a way of delivering information as though it were no more than a passing observation, which often means it is the one thing that refuses to leave the mind. Over tea that morning, his tea which is invariably stronger than mine, he mentioned that a young man had been seen speaking to Father Lacey before evensong. Dark coat, dark hair, and an accent that none of the parishioners could place. No one knew him, and no one could say where he had gone when the service began. It was the sort of detail that will not at first declare its importance, but insists upon being kept. I went back to the chapel that afternoon. The day had the flat light of approaching rain, the sort that makes stone seem older and ivy greener. The building itself looked smaller than I had remembered, its walls mottled by lichen, the leaded windows dulled by years of weather. The door gave slightly under my hand, as though it had been opened often that day. Inside, the scent met me first. Lilies, oversweet and just at the point of decline, mingled with the steadier undertone of candle wax. The sort of smell one remembers from funerals more than weddings. It filled the air with a faint heaviness, as though it had soaked into the wood of the pews themselves. I stood a moment to let my eyes adjust. The chapel was unremarkable in its proportions. Narrow nave, modest altar, a pair of carved angels holding candlesticks at the chancel steps. Someone had left the votive candles burning. Their flames wavered slightly in the draught from the open door. Lewis's description of the stranger returned as I walked the length of the aisle. I tried to imagine the conversation, the priest leaning slightly towards the young man, perhaps in welcome, perhaps in caution. It is the quality of a meeting that stays with a witness more than the words, and none of those who saw them could decide whether the exchange had been warm or cool. On the lectern by the front pew lay a visitor's register, a thick, leather-bound book with pages furred at the edges from years of turning. Most entries were in the cramped hand of tourists, occasional comments about the beauty of the windows or the stillness of the place. But near the bottom of the most recent page was an oddity. One name, written in a firm hand, then scored through with such force that the nib had torn the paper. It was the sort of obliteration one does not make by accident. Whoever had done it had intended the name to be unreadable. But intention is not always enough. The tail of a capital letter remained, curling beneath the black gouge of ink, and the faint loop of another letter half buried in the tear. It was impossible to reconstruct the whole, yet it was equally impossible to ignore the impulse behind its destruction. I closed the book and found that my fingers smelled faintly of the ink, though the entry could not have been fresh. That was the second time in 2 days that I had touched something I felt I ought not to have. The organ pipes stood against the north wall, silent now, but giving off their own odour of dust and varnish. I thought of the bell, that sudden interruption, and wondered if the same hand that had stilled it had also crossed out the name. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves of the ivy. I took the long way round to the gate, passing again the bench where I had last seen Father Lacey. The grass was wetter now, the flattened arc still visible but darkened by the rain. Lewis was waiting in the car, the wipers keeping time with the drizzle. He asked if I had learned anything useful. Only that someone had wanted to be both present and absent, I said, which, when you think about it, is another way of describing a ghost. Miss Elwood kept her office as one might keep a locked drawer, not out of secrecy exactly, but with the mild defensiveness of someone who believes every piece of paper might some day be required as evidence. She was brisk in manner, though her eyes gave her away. They softened when she spoke of Father Lacey, as if reluctant to let him be reduced to a mere subject of inquiry. She told me about the letter, without prompting. It had arrived, she said, 2, perhaps 3 days before his death. Plain envelope, no return address. She had placed it on his desk while he was meeting a parishioner. When he returned and saw it there, she said, it was as though the colour had drained right out of him. He had opened it at once, read whatever it contained, and then, she hesitated here, folded it with a sort of precision that looked in retrospect like dread. He had not mentioned its contents, nor left the envelope in his wastepaper basket. She had not seen it again. We spoke a little longer, and in the way of such conversations, other facts emerged almost incidentally. That he had once taught theology at the university, a promising scholar she called him, but had resigned abruptly in the mid-1980s. She did not know why, and I suspected she would not have told me even if she had. Later that afternoon I visited the small study adjoining the vestry, the one that served as his private retreat. The air was stale with the faint residue of incense and the sharper tang of old paper. Books lined the walls in a manner that suggested both order and a reluctance to part with anything. There was no sign of the letter, though I had not truly expected to find it. On the desk, beneath a stack of parish bulletins, lay an open crossword book. The pencil beside it was blunt, the shavings in the small desk bin tinged with pink cedar. Most of the puzzles were only half completed, the inked letters trailing off mid-clue as though he had been interrupted. But one entry had been filled in firmly without hesitation. Sin concealed in silent prayer, The answer already written. Confession. I traced the word with my eyes more than with my hand, though my fingers itched to test the ink for freshness. It was the neat, rounded script of someone accustomed to writing for others to read, a teacher's hand. And yet, there was something in the certainty of those letters that made me pause. It is a habit of mine to consider the clue before the answer. Sin concealed in silent prayer, a neat construction, a small puzzle folded in upon itself. To conceal something in prayer is to hold it inward, unspoken. Confession, by contrast, is its opposite, the bearing of what was hidden. The clue did not so much describe the word as invert it, as though the answer lay in the shadow rather than the light. I sat for some time, letting the silence of the study press in. Outside I could hear the muffled drip of rain from the chapel roof into the gutters, an unhurried rhythm that seemed older than the building itself. The books around me, Augustine, Newman, the more arid German theologians, stood like mute witnesses. I thought again of the stranger in the dark coat, of the crossed-out name in the visitor's register, and now of the letter that had so altered the priest's complexion. Whatever was written in it, he had carried it with him to the end, just as he had once carried whatever it was that had driven him from the university 30 years before. Before leaving, I closed the crossword book and placed it where I had found it. The answer remained there, inked in the steady hand of a man who must have known, better than most, that confession can sometimes be the truest form of silence. There are times in an investigation when the field of possibility feels as wide and empty as Port Meadow in winter, and others when it contracts to a small, airless room in which every face appears to carry the same shadow. By the end of that week, I'd arrived at 4 names, not because they were the only ones who might have known, but because each seemed, in their own way, to have been standing close enough to hear the bell stop. Dr. Adrian Miles came first, a brittle man in his late 30s, with the impatient gait of someone whose mind is always 3 sentences ahead of his tongue. His fellowship at St. Anselm's rested on a benefaction tied directly to the parish. He had the kind of ambition that wears its civility like a press suit, neat but easily creased. We met in his book-lined office, where he spoke briskly about his admiration for Father Lacey's scholarship, though I noticed his eyes lingered on the clock whenever I let the silence draw out. He had not, he said, seen anything unusual that evening. But there was a moment, just before he turned back to his desk, when his hand drifted to the papers beside him, as though to shield them from view. Sister Margaret was another matter entirely, a compact figure in a dark habit, her hands folded with the stillness of stone. She had worked closely with Lacey on outreach programs in the more frayed corners of the city, and she guarded his name as one might guard a relic. When I asked if she had noticed anything amiss, she met my gaze without blinking and told me that Father Lacey had died in God's service, and that was all anyone needed to know. It was not evasion exactly, more the closing of a door that had never been mine to open. Thomas Harrow, the organist, looked older than his 50 years, his hair thin and his clothes smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and damp wool. His manner was amiable enough, though there was a certain defeated air about him, a man used to losing more than he gained. I'd heard of his unpaid debts, of the whispers about his bouts of depression, but he spoke of music with a quiet warmth, describing how he had chosen the hymns for that night. He claimed not to have noticed the stranger, though he admitted his attention was elsewhere. The bell had stopped, he said, because the verger had been slow in the tower. But the tone in which he said it lacked conviction, as though he'd rehearsed the explanation and grown weary of hearing it himself. And then there was Eleanor Vance, tall, elegant, her manner measured to the point of withholding. She was an art historian of some repute, her connection to Lacey forged during the restoration of a 15th-century triptych in the chapel. We met in the Ashmolean Café, where she stirred her tea slowly, as though buying time to decide what to tell me. She spoke of Lacey with a detached fondness, like someone recalling a teacher from a former life. On the night in question she had arrived late, slipping into a pew just before the Magnificat. No, she had seen nothing unusual. But when she rose to leave, the sleeve of her coat brushed against mine, and I caught the faint scent of lilies, the same scent that had clung to the chapel air. Each of them, in their own way, gave me a version of the evening that was smooth at the surface and slightly fractured beneath. Miles with his guarded papers, Margaret with her unwavering piety, Harrow with his too prompt explanation, Eleanor with her lilies. None of them lied outright, but none allowed the truth to stand entirely alone. That night, in my flat, I took out a sheet of paper and wrote their names in a column. Beside each, I left a space, not for alibis or evidence, but for the small, unarticulated thing that I could feel but not yet name. Outside, the rain began again, tapping lightly against the glass like someone rehearsing a knock they did not yet wish to deliver. It was an elderly parishioner, Mrs. Pritchard, with the sort of precise enunciation that suggests a lifetime of correcting others, who first brought me the story. She had been in the sacristy earlier that week, returning altar linens when she overheard raised voices. Not shouting, she was careful to say, but a tone of urgency one does not expect in holy places. Father Lacey and Thomas Harrow, the organist. A payment was mentioned, and then the sound of a door closing more forcefully than manners allow. She had, of course, not meant to listen, but once heard, the words had stayed with her. It was enough to set Lewis rummaging through the parish accounts, with the thoroughness of a man who has never misplaced a receipt in his life. By the following afternoon he had found it. 2 cheques drawn from the parish account, both bearing Lacey's signature in ink, but with a subtle tremor that suggested another hand had imitated it. The payee in each case was Harrow. The amounts were not grand, but enough to matter to a man with creditors. We went together to speak with him. His flat above the music shop was dim, the curtains drawn despite the thin sunlight outside. Harrow himself looked worn, but not surprised, as though he had been waiting for us to arrive. I told him about the cheques. Lewis placed them gently on the table between us, the paper curling faintly at the edges. Harrow did not deny them. He admitted the forgery almost at once, his voice quiet, as though the admission were a kind of relief. Lacey had found out within a day, he said. He had come to Harrow's rooms, the cheques in hand, and asked for an explanation. Harrow had none that could excuse him. He had expected anger, dismissal, perhaps even the police. Instead, Lacey had told him to consider the matter closed, provided it never happened again. It was the only kind thing anyone's done for me, Harrow said, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that was not quite shame and not quite gratitude, but a strange amalgam of the two. If kindness was involved, I asked, why the argument Mrs. Pritchard had overheard? Harrow rubbed his eyes as though the effort of recollection was a physical strain. Lacey had reminded him, gently but firmly, that there could be no more advances. Harrow, facing another creditor's letter, had pressed his case. The disagreement had ended without resolution. Lewis, whose patience is a more useful tool than my own, steered the conversation toward the night of Lacey's death. Harrow's account was clear. He had been in the Mike organ loft, arranging music for the following Sunday. Several parishioners had seen him there. One had even spoken to him during the interval before evensong. The timeline, though I was reluctant to concede it, placed him far from the vestry at the moment Lacey's heart had failed. After we left, I walked a short distance alone, letting Lewis take the car. The streets around the parish were slick from a passing shower, their paving stones darkened to a muted sheen. I found myself thinking about the word payment, how it need not always refer to money. There are debts that lie in the heart as much as in the ledger, and kindness, I have learned, can bind more tightly than guilt. By the time I reached the college gates, I knew Harrow's theft was not the key, though it might have been an elegant motive in another story. It was, in the end, a distraction, the sort of detail that flashes brightly for a moment before sinking into the dark where the real shape of things waits to be seen. That evening at my desk, I underlined Harrow's name on the list I had made. Not to cross it out, not yet, but to remind myself that the first red herring can be the most persuasive precisely because it swims so close to the truth without ever touching it. Miss Elwood kept me waiting longer than was necessary. It was her way of deciding how much to yield and on what terms. At last, with a sigh that seemed to age her a little, she drew from her desk a single envelope, its flap unsealed but the crease sharp, as if it had been folded and set aside with deliberate care. She said she had found it among Father Lacey's personal papers after his death, tucked inside the front cover of a missal. She had hesitated to mention it, not out of disloyalty, but because she was not sure that passing it to me would not somehow betray him. The envelope was addressed simply M. The hand was Lacey's, the same rounded, deliberate script I had seen in the crossword book. Inside, a single sheet written entirely in Latin. The ink was faint in places, the lines evenly spaced, as though composed with a ruler's invisible guidance. Peccatum commune, silentium nimis diu servatum. I translated slowly, aloud in my mind. A sin shared, a silence kept too long. The rest was no less elliptical, a mixture of confession and petition, couched in the kind of phrasing I had seen in certain medieval breviaries. It spoke of the weight of mutual knowledge, of an error whose keeping had become a burden to both parties, and of the need, before the closing of the gate, to speak what had been left unsaid. The tone was curiously impersonal, almost liturgical, as if the writer were less a man than a voice officiating over some private sacrament. And yet, the final sentence, no more than 5 words, returned to the first person with an abrupt intimacy. I cannot keep it alone. The letter was undated. That absence, I suspected, was deliberate. I asked Miss Elwood if she knew the identity of M. She looked at me a moment, then shook her head, but her hesitation was too long to be the hesitation of ignorance. She left me with the letter, though I sensed it cost her something to do so. Back in my rooms, I turned to the college archives, a labyrinth of catalogues, handwritten indexes, and the peculiar dust that seems to belong only to old academic paper. I was not looking for M at first, but for any trace of Father Lacey's years at the university. The official record was thin: an appointment to a theology lectureship, several published essays on patristics, and then, abruptly, a year's gap before his return to parish work. It was in an old departmental newsletter, the sort of thing printed on cheap paper and stapled unevenly, that I found the connection. A photograph, blurred at the edges, of a much younger Lacey seated beside a student, dark-haired, intense, his features less set than they would later become. The caption named him as Adrian Miles, winner of a prize for an essay on Aquinas. In the margin of the newsletter, someone, a later archivist perhaps, had noted, both absent from college records 1985 to 86, circumstances unclear. A scandal, then. The word was not used, but absence is often its only surviving trace. Whether it was the kind whispered in common rooms or the kind shrouded in official euphemism, the effect was the same. Both men gone, both returned to altered trajectories. Miles had resumed his studies, later carving out an academic post. Lacey had not returned to teaching. The letter in my pocket felt heavier as I left the archives. The autumn air outside was sharp, the clouds low over the spires. I walked without much direction, thinking about the phrasing, a sin shared, and the particular intimacy of its grammar. If the émoi of the letter was Miles, then the sin, whatever its nature, had bound them in silence for 30 years. Silence is not, I have learned, a neutral thing. It gathers sediment. And sometimes, by the time it is broken, Parish Library was the sort of room in which time slowed without protest. A dim, high-ceilinged space lined with books in cracked bindings, the air tinged with the resinous sweetness of polished oak. Dust floated in the narrow shafts of light from the clerestory windows, and somewhere in the corner an old clock marked the hour with a dull, delayed chime. I had come there without a specific aim, which is often the only way to find something worth finding. On a narrow table beneath a case of early hymnals stood a row of photographs in mismatched frames. Most were parish fetes, confirmations, the sort of ceremonial groups where the eyes are as stiff as the collars. But one frame, darker than the rest, caught my attention. The photograph within was black and white, dated in neat handwriting. Oxford Theological Conference, 1983. The figures stood in 2 rows before a weathered stone doorway. I recognized Lacey at once, younger certainly, but with the same composed posture, the same gaze that seemed to be listening rather than looking. Beside him, a lean, dark-haired Adrian Miles, his expression somewhere between pride and defiance. At the edge of the front row was Eleanor Vance, though I might not have known her without the caption. Her hair was longer then, her smile unguarded, in a way I had not yet seen from her in life. And there was another, or rather, there had been. The face of a man in the back row had been scored through with some sharp instrument, The emulsion scraped away to a pale, ragged oval. The violence of the act was at odds with the studied stillness of the image, a deliberate erasure, not a careless accident. I turned the frame over. On the back, in faded ink, a short inscription, "To G, in silence." The G could only have been Lacey, and the hand, rounded, steady, was almost certainly his. When I met Eleanor later that day, in the shadowed quiet of the Ashmolean's upper gallery, I mentioned the photograph. She looked at me for a long moment, the way one might look at a piece of art that stirs recognition before memory. Then she nodded, once. Yes, she said. She had known him, the man whose face was no longer there. His name was David Armitage, a seminarian in those years. Brilliant in a way that made others uncomfortable, and careless in a way that eventually made him vulnerable. He had disappeared after certain allegations. Plagiarism, yes, but also something more ambiguous, less easily proven. Misconduct, she called it, without elaboration. One day he was present, the next gone. What became of him, I asked. I don't know, she said, or perhaps I don't want to. The tone was not sharp, but final, the line one draws before a door that must remain shut. I thought of pressing further, but there is a moment when insistence yields less than restraint, and I have learned grudgingly to recognize it. As I left her, I recalled the inscription again, in silence. Silence as gift or as warning. In that brief phrase was the suggestion of a pact, or perhaps a confession never fully spoken. Back in my rooms that evening, I set the photograph on my desk, the scratched-out oval staring blankly at me under the lamplight. I found myself tracing the outlines of the other faces, as if their proximity might yield something of the one that had been destroyed. Lacey's head tilted slightly towards the missing man. Miles's gaze was directed away, fixed on something beyond the frame. And Eleanor, she had been looking directly at the camera, but her eyes, in the grain of the photograph, seemed already to know. A conference in 1983, a disappearance soon after, a dedication that spoke of silence as though it could be shared. It was not the absence in the photograph that troubled me most. It was the fact that someone had taken the trouble to make that absence visible. The original sound is lost beneath the weight of what has been left, unsaid. Morse had always mistrusted elegance, not the elegance of thought or a well-shaped line of verse that he admired, but the cool, lacquered kind that seemed to hide more than it revealed. Eleanor Vance had that sort of elegance in abundance, the unhurried gestures, the stillness that made her seem immune to hurry or alarm, the faint, distant smile that could be either charm or warning. The suspicion came to him not in a flash, but as an accumulation. The way she had been present at the conference in the photograph, the stubborn silence about the man whose face was scratched away, and her art project, funded by a benefactor she would not name. Lewis brought him the bank records late in the afternoon, still smelling faintly of chip-shop vinegar. "Anonymous deposits," he said, sliding the folder across Morse's desk. 4 of them over the last year, not small either. Morse scanned the figures, eyebrows rising. "Enough to make a struggling academic solvent," he murmured. "And our Miss Vance isn't struggling, is she?" "She says the donor's confidential," Lewis added. "Doesn't sit right." Morse rose, put on his coat, and crossed to the Ashmolean, where Eleanor had her makeshift workspace, a side room given over to canvases under restoration, the air thick with the scent of linseed oil and varnish. She looked up from a half-cleaned panel, setting down her swab as if she had been expecting him. "You're not here for the art," she said. "No," said Morse, "I'm here for the money. Anonymous deposits. 4 of them. I'm guessing you know something about that." Her expression did not change. She walked to a narrow cupboard, unlocked it, and withdrew a small folio. Inside were letters on cream-laid paper, each in the same sloping hand. "My late uncle," she said. These were from him. He was a bibliophile. Rare theological works, 17th century mostly. After he died, the estate sold them off piece by piece. The money went to me, for the restoration work. If I didn't want the local press sniffing round, I had the executor deposit them discreetly. Anonymous, as you say. Morse glanced at the letters. The tone was affectionate, entirely mundane. Still, he pressed. Why the secrecy? She returned to her chair, lifting the swab again. Not everything in life is a scandal, Inspector. Sometimes it's just privacy. He held her gaze a moment longer, but there was nothing to catch hold of. No tremor in the voice, no twitch of unease, just that impenetrable calm. Later, back in the car, Lewis said, "Well, that's that, isn't it? She's clean." Morse looked out of the window at the evening light over the rooftops. Perhaps, but she knows more about Lacey than she's telling. They all do. A silence settled between them, the kind Morse disliked. It meant the trail had gone cold. Yet even cold trails, he knew, could warm again. Morse sat in his office, the blinds half drawn against the late afternoon glare. A dust-speckled shaft of sunlight cut across his desk, illuminating the pile of Lewis's notes like some relic on a scholar's lectern. He was halfway through a tepid cup of tea, the kind Lewis brewed when he thought Morse ought to be kept off the beer, when his eyes snagged on a single line in the transcript of Sister Margaret's first interview. "Against you only have we sinned." It was nothing dramatic, no trumpet blast of revelation, merely the tiniest alteration to Psalm 51, the confessionary text known by any Anglican, Catholic or Protestant worth their salt. Morse knew it by heart. The original read, "Against you, you only have I sinned," singular, penitent and personal. But Margaret had made it plural. We. Morse's mind began to coil around the word like ivy on a gravestone. The crossword clue from Lacey's desk surfaced again. Sin concealed in silent prayer, and with it the Latin letter peccatum commune, silentium nimis longum. A sin shared, a silence kept too long. He lit a cigarette, ignoring the inevitable lecture from the station's health inspector. The match flared briefly in the dimming office, and with it came the faintest whiff of something like comprehension. "Sir?" Lewis appeared in the doorway, carrying a file and looking faintly apologetic. "Sorry, didn't realize you were thinking." "You rarely do," Morse said without heat. "Sit down. Tell me, when Sister Margaret quoted scripture to you, did she seem deliberate?" Lewis frowned. She was calm, measured, like she'd rehearsed it. "You think it means something?" "I think," Morse said slowly, "that people make mistakes in the heat of conversation. But Sister Margaret strikes me as the sort who hasn't made an unconsidered remark in 30 years. And she didn't say I sinned. She said we." Lewis blinked. "Meaning what? That she and Lacey did something together?" "Perhaps," Morse said. "Or perhaps she and someone else. But whatever it was enough for Lacey to carry to his grave, and for her to drop into conversation like a breadcrumb she didn't expect anyone to notice." He slid the Latin letter across the desk. "Have another look." Lewis scanned the neat, slanted handwriting. A sin shared, a silence kept too long. To M. Could that be Margaret? That's what I'm beginning to wonder. Morse tapped the edge of the paper with a nicotine-stained finger. "And look at the structure. It reads like a prayer, almost liturgical. I'd wager Lacey meant it to be recognized by the recipient, but he never sent it." Lewis thought for a moment. Could be that he'd decided to confess, end the silence. Morse leaned back, exhaling smoke. Or that he wanted her to join him in doing so, and perhaps she refused. They sat in silence for a moment, the muffled hum of traffic outside seeping in. Then Lewis said, "Sir, you don't think she—" "I think," Morse interrupted, "that guilt is a peculiar thing, Lewis. It binds people as much as it separates them, and when one party threatens to speak—" He left the sentence hanging. The church bells of St. Aldate's began to toll somewhere in the distance, a slow, measured rhythm. Morse stubbed out his cigarette, rose, and reached for his coat. "Come on," he said. "Where to?" "To see a nun about a psalm." The vestry was dim when Morse entered. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass so that coloured shapes drifted across the stone flags, like pieces of a half-forgotten dream. Sister Margaret stood near the altar table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. She did not turn as he approached. "I think you already know why I'm here," Morse began. Her shoulders stiffened, but she kept her gaze fixed on the small brass cross before her. "I imagine it's about the letter." "And the photograph," Morse said softly. "And the psalm you misquoted." At this, she did turn, her expression one of weariness rather than defiance. "You're cleverer than you look, Inspector." "I've been told that," he murmured, though not always kindly. There was a long pause. Somewhere in the church a door creaked, and a gust of cooler air stirred the scent of lilies left from the funeral. Morse could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a steady, unrelenting rhythm. "You shielded him," Morse said finally, the man whose face was scratched out. "You and Lacey." "Yes," she admitted. Her voice was low, almost inaudible. We told ourselves it was compassion, that he was young, gifted, misunderstood. But the truth was uglier. The accusation was real. The boy he hurt never came back to the parish. She swallowed, her hands trembling now. And Lacey never forgave himself for helping to cover it. Morse's eyes rested on the small lamp burning in the corner, the perpetual light of the sanctuary. "You thought you were saving a soul, but you were saving your own conscience from the stain of betrayal." She flinched, and for a moment the stern nun was gone. In her place stood a frightened, middle-aged woman who had been carrying a secret far too long. It was Lacey's idea to keep him out of the scandal. Mine to make sure the papers never knew. We thought silence was mercy. "And the Latin letter?" "His confession," she said simply. After all these years, he'd decided to tell the bishop, to accept whatever came. He gave me the draft to read. I told him not to send it. I thought it would only drag the past through the mud again. God forgive me. Morse paced the narrow space between the altar and the vestry door. "And the man who came to Evensong?" "That was his son," she said, her eyes fixed on some point far away. "He didn't even know who his father was until recently. He'd been searching records, old photographs. He found us. He came to ask Lacey the truth." "What happened in here?" Morse's voice was softer now. "They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I was in the side chapel, but I could hear their voices, low, strained, then silence. When I came in, Lacey was on the floor. I called the ambulance, but it was too late." Her eyes glistened. "The boy?" He looked as if the whole world had been taken from him twice over. He left before the paramedics arrived. Lewis, who had been standing by the door all this time, shifted uncomfortably. "We'll need his name, sister." "I don't know it," she said quickly, and Morse believed her. Lacey didn't write it down. The register, he crossed it out himself. The chapel bell tolled the hour, deep and resonant. Morse closed his notebook, the gesture deliberate. "You realize, sister, that what you've told me, what you've lived with, it doesn't make you innocent, but it does make you human." Her eyes met his then, and for a brief moment there was no nun and no detective, only two weary souls, both more acquainted with regret than they cared to admit. As they stepped out into the fading light, Morse looked back once at the vestry door. It stood slightly ajar, the shadows inside already reclaiming the space. He had the strange, uneasy sense that this room had swallowed more than one confession, and that some of them would never be heard in any court, earthly or divine. The coroner's verdict was brief and clinical: myocardial infarction, natural causes, no mention of guilt, nor of the decades of silence that had fermented in the vestry like altar wine gone sour. The police report closed with a note from Morse. No further action. He almost added a line from Milton, but thought better of it. The young man, nameless in the official record, though Morse knew it, had left that morning on the 8:12 to Paddington. He'd taken no breakfast, no farewell. Lewis had seen him waiting on the platform, hands deep in his pockets, head bent against the drizzle. There'd been something unfinished in his posture, as though half a question still lingered on his lips. Sister Margaret submitted her resignation in an envelope addressed to the diocesan office. She did not return to the parish after her final meeting with Morse. Lewis found her room already stripped bare, habit and veil folded on the bed, a single rosary coiled like a sleeping snake. No forwarding address, no promise of return. Dr. Miles was more discreet. His signature appeared in the minutes of a college meeting, authorizing the temporary restriction of certain archival materials, pending further cataloguing. Morse knew that phrase well. It meant the papers would vanish into a locked cupboard until the people involved were dead, or until a scholar with the right surname decided otherwise. The city went on as before. Bells in, the high, bicycles rattling over cobbles, students chattering beneath the Bodleian's stone gaze. The vestry smelled faintly of polish, the floor scrubbed clean. Only Morse noticed that the dark patch in the corner, the one where Lacey had fallen, was a fraction lighter than the rest, as though someone had rubbed too hard, hoping to erase more than dust. That evening, Morse found himself in Eleanor Vance's sitting room, a Georgian flat with books stacked too deep along the walls. A decanter of claret sat on the low table. They spoke little. The silences were not awkward, merely inevitable. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the lamplight picking out the fine bones of her face. She asked once quietly, "Will you write it down?" "Some things," Morse replied, "are better left to memory, and memory is better left alone." They drank until the rain thickened against the window. Outside, the street lamps smeared gold across the wet pavement. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with dust and wine. She touched his hand once lightly, not as an invitation but as a kind of farewell. He did not return it. When he rose to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door. Neither mentioned seeing each other again. She closed it softly behind him. Morse stepped out into the night, coat collar turned up, the rain cool on his face. He thought of Lacey's letter, a sin shared, a silence kept too long, and of the psalm Sister Margaret had misquoted. The words clung to him like the smell of incense after a long service, impossible to wash away. Justice had not been done. But then, justice was a word the law liked to borrow from morality without paying rent. Sometimes the truth was the best one could manage, and even then it came stripped of satisfaction. At the corner, Morse paused beneath a flickering street lamp. Somewhere in the dark, a piano was playing, something slow, minor, unresolved. He let the sound follow him as he walked toward the river, not knowing whether he sought company or solitude, only that both were the same tonight. Sunday morning came to Oxford with the softest light, a pale wash that seemed to linger between night and day, uncertain which it belonged to. The streets were damp from the night's rain, their cobbles darkened and slick. Morse's shoes tapped against them as he walked from his flat towards St. Bartholomew's, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat. The churchyard was nearly empty when he arrived. A single elderly man in a long coat stood by the lich gate, hat in hand, as though considering whether to enter. He caught Morse's eye, nodded briefly and wandered away. The absence of the usual bustle, no flower arrangers, no choir boys darting in and out, made the place feel suspended, as though time itself had been postponed. From somewhere within the tower came the muffled clank of the bell being prepared for the morning service. Morse paused at the foot of the stone steps, listening. There was a sudden, singular toll, deep, resonant, and final, and then nothing. No peal, no rhythm, only silence. He waited, but the sound did not return. Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly with wax and stone dust. The altar cloth had been changed, crisp and white, and a vase of lilies sat beside the pulpit. Lewis was standing in the aisle, speaking quietly with the verger. He turned when Morse approached. "Bell rope's been untied," Lewis said, shrugging. "Nothing broken, just undone." Morse didn't answer. He moved toward the vestry, his eyes drawn almost unconsciously to the spot where Lacey had collapsed. The chair had been moved, the desk cleared, though he could still see, in his mind's eye, the crossword puzzle lying there, a handful of empty squares remaining. The clue about sin concealed had been penciled in faintly, the answer half-formed. The morning service began without the bell. Voices rose in unaccompanied hymn, their harmonies filling the space with something fragile and uncertain. Morse stood at the back, listening, his gaze on the memorial plaques along the wall. Names carved in stone, dates reduced to dashes between numbers, whole lives compressed to that narrow span. When the final hymn ended, he remained in place as the congregation filed out. The organist packed away her music. Sister Margaret's replacement, a younger woman with careful eyes, extinguished the altar candles. The air felt heavier as the church emptied, as though silence itself had settled into the rafters. Morse stepped outside again. Rain had begun to fall, a fine mist that blurred the outlines of the spires beyond the rooftops. Drops collected on the iron gate, sliding down like slow tears. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the damp air, and thought of Lacey, of the letter unsent, of sins that had ripened in darkness for decades. He thought of the son who had come looking for answers and left with more questions. He thought, too, of Sister Margaret's resignation, of Dr. Miles sealing away the archives. Some truths, he realized, were never brought into the light. They lay beneath the surface, shaping lives without ever declaring themselves. Perhaps justice was too crude a word for such matters. Perhaps all that remained was the weight of knowing. He finished his cigarette, ground it beneath his heel, and began the walk back toward the road. Behind him, the church loomed, its tower stark against the soft grey sky. The bell rope, he imagined, still hung loose in the dark of the ringing chamber, waiting for hands that would not return. As he reached the gate, a sudden gust of wind stirred the rain, sending it slantwise across the gravestones. Morse glanced once more at the silent tower. There was nothing to hear but the soft hiss of rain on stone. Some silences, he thought, were not to be broken.